It's May the 31st, 2021, and our reading today in 1 Samuel is in chapter 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but with me only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand and he hurled it, saying to himself, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David eluded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. Saul said to David, "Here's my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." But David said to Saul, "Who am I? And what is my family or my father's clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. Now Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. "I will give her to him," he thought, "so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." So Saul said to David, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." Then Saul ordered his attendants, "Speak to David privately and say, 'Look, the king is pleased with you, and his attendants all like you. Now become his son-in-law.'" They repeated these words to David, but David said, "Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." When Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, "Say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter, Michal, in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy for the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. Amen. Now, one of the reasons why the Bible is such a popular book and people love to read it is because it does deal with all the great issues that concern all of us in life. War and peace. We've seen that again and again, and that from the dawn of time has been human experience. And today, perhaps even more personally, love and hate. Love, the word love pops up at least 4 times in this chapter, as I'm sure you would have noted as we just read it. Even in the opening verse 1, we have Jonathan's love for David, the love of a best friend. Then in verse 16, it says, all Israel loved David. They were devoted to him because he was their successful, brilliant military commander who led them into battle. And that's how they won those battles. There's a devotion in war. And then there's, of course, romance. Saul's daughter Michal, it says, was in love with David. There was a time when we almost could have said of Saul that he loved David. I'm not sure that word is ever used, but he certainly appreciated him. He had deep respect for him. When David would play his harp and bring calmness and peace to him. When he went into the battle with Goliath and brought the giant down and delivered Israel that day. And also as one of his greatest military commanders. We've said this already. Whatever Saul sent him to do, verse 5, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. So I know the word isn't actually used, but I mean, love is a very broad, expansive category, as we've seen already. I think there's a sense in which we could say, to begin with, even Saul loved David, but how quickly that love begins to fade and ebb away and gives way rather to hate. Specifically now, Saul's hate. His hatred for David. Again, the word isn't used, but it might be used in other chapters along the way, because this is how the story is going to unfold now in the next few days. But even if the word isn't specifically there, the concept is there. And all the attributes, all the things that make up hatred are now becoming true of Saul. His anger at David because of his success, both militarily in terms of being popular and God's favor upon him. He's very angry with this young man. When this evil spirit from God comes upon him and torments him, he just wants to kill David with his spear. He tries that a few times, verse 11. He's very afraid of David. I mean, David's who's this young little boy, really, relatively speaking. But Saul is quaking in his boots now. And if the obvious outright attempt at murder by throwing the javelin doesn't kill him, he'll use a very sneaky plan by marrying him off to one of his daughters and having this strategy where he'll go into battle against the Philistines. He'll be in the front line. That'll finish him off. In fact, he comes back victorious, more victorious than ever before. And that's how the chapter ends. And the root of it all, so much hatred, stems from this, is verse 9. And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Jealousy. So often, jealousy leads to hatred. So in this chapter, we see these two things which are so common in life. We've all experienced it, and we're all struggling with these emotions and feelings and problems, either in the way we relate to others, the way they relate to us. Love and hate. In the New Testament, it's very clear about this, particularly in 1 John. It's a great place to go to get very clear apostolic teaching on what the Lord wants. 1 John 4:19-21. We love because he, God, first loved us. If anyone says, I love God, yet hates his brother, he is a liar. For anyone who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. And he's given us this command: whoever loves God must also love his brother. Love and hate, two very different characteristics that will show the difference between a believer who truly loves and an unbeliever who so easily will give into and express hatred. Two very different types of people, two very different ultimate destinations, either to heaven or to hell.